The nervous system. The first couple of slides are combining forms for the nervous system, followed by suffixes for the nervous system, and different abbreviations related to the nervous system. The general functions of the nervous system are master, control, and communication system of the body. Every thought, action, and emotion is a result of its activity. And the nervous system uses electrical impulses to interpret and respond to what is happening inside and outside the body. The main components of the nervous system are the brain, spinal cord, sensory organs, and nerves. So first you have the sensory input. Sensory receptors gather information from the environment and send it to the brain for processing. A stimulus is anything that causes a response. Millions of sensory receptors monitor changes or stimuli that take place inside and outside the body. Examples of stimuli are images detected by the eye, sensations detected by an internal organ or the skin, and sounds detected by the ears. After sensory input, you have integration. The brain processes the sensory input and decides what should be done in response. So stimuli travel to the brain and spinal cord to be integrated, and then decisions are made on how to respond. Finally, after integration, you have motor output, which is the actual response to the stimuli in the form of a movement of a muscle or action of a gland. So messages are sent from the brain to the muscles and glands that cause a response within the body. So the next couple of slides are examples of how the brain and spinal cord function to recognize and respond to stimuli. Neurons are information messengers. They use electrical impulses and chemical signals to transmit information between different areas of the brain and between the brain and the rest of the nervous system. There are two types of cells found in nervous tissue, glial cells and neurons. Neurons are highly specialized to receive and transmit electrical and chemical signals. The electrical signals are called neural impulses or action potentials. Neurons are excitable cells. They have the ability to respond to stimuli and to convert stimuli into nerve impulses. Neurons have a long lifespan but are irreplaceable. You have billions of neurons responsible for sending electrical impulses from one part of the body to another. Couple parts of the neuron. So dendrites are highly branched fibers that extend from the cell body. They are specialized to receive neural impulses and transmit them to the cell body. The myelin sheath is a lipid or fat layer. It insulates the axon and increases the rate of impulse transmission. Soma is the cell body. It produces organelles, produces proteins needed for a neuron to send and receive impulses, and contains the nucleus. The nodes of Ranvier are gaps between Schwann cells, which we'll talk about on the next slide. The impulses jump from node to node, increasing transmission speed. The Schwann cells are major glial cells in the peripheral nervous system. They wrap around the axons, and they keep peripheral nerves healthy and functioning. An axon is the fiber that conducts impulses away from the cell body toward the axon terminal, and therefore the next neuron. Axon terminals are branching fibers at the end of the axon. They contain vesicles with neurotransmitters. An axon transmits neural messages from the cell body toward another neuron. At the distal end, the axon divides extensively, forming many terminal branches that end in synaptic terminals. The synaptic terminals release neurotransmitters, which are chemical compounds that transmit signals from one neuron to another. Axons of many neurons of the peripheral nervous system have two covers, an inner myelin sheath and an outer neurolemma. Both coverings are formed by support cells known as Schwann cells. The neurolemma is important in growth of neurons and in the repair of injured neurons. Myelin, a fatty white substance, speeds the conduction of nerve impulses. So this here is a picture of a neuron, and you can see the different parts that we just discussed. Glial cells support and protect neurons. There are 4 types. Astrocytes are star-shaped glial cells that support, protect, and communicate with neurons. They help regulate the composition of the extracellular fluid in the central nervous system by removing excess potassium ions. They may be important in memory and learning. Oligodendrocytes form insulating myelin sheaths around neurons in the CNS, or central nervous system. Ependymal cells line cavities in the central nervous system. They also produce and circulate cerebral spinal fluid. When the brain is infected or injured, microglia multiply and move to the affected area. They remove bacteria and debris by phagocytosis, which is the ingestion of bacteria or other materials. So a nerve is a large bundle of axons wrapped in connective tissue. We can compare a nerve to a telephone cable. The axons are like the individual wires, and the myelin sheaths are the insulation. A ganglion is a mass of cell bodies attached to the axons of a nerve. Within the central nervous system, bundles of axons are known as tracts or pathways. Neural signaling is communication among neurons. The events involved in neural signaling are reception, transmission, integration, transmission, and actual response. So reception is receiving the information. Transmission is the process of sending messages along a neuron, from one neuron to another, or from a neuron to a muscle or gland. Afferent or sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system transmit information to neurons in the central nervous system. Integration is when the information provided by the receptors is sorted and interpreted, and then an appropriate response is determined. Then the signal is transmitted again. So interneurons transmit information to efferent or motor neurons. Efferent neurons then transmit the message to the effectors, the muscles or the glands. Finally, you have the actual response. Muscles and glands are referred to as effectors because they cause an effect in response to the messages from the nervous system. A synapse is a junction between 2 neurons. Resting potential is the membrane potential in a resting, so not excited neuron. Voltage is measured across the plasma membrane of a neuron that is not transmitting a message. Action potential is a wave of depolarization that moves down the axon. You can have an all or none response, continuous conduction, or saltatory conduction. In most cells, there is a difference in electrical charge across the plasma membrane. The inside of the cell has a more negative electrical charge than the extracellular fluid outside the cell. The plasma membrane is said to be electrically polarized. This means that one side, or pole, has a different charge from the other side. When electrical charges are separated in this way, a potential energy difference exists across the membrane. The difference in electrical charge across the plasma membrane produces an electrical gradient. Voltage is the force that causes charged particles to flow between the 2 points. The voltage measured across the plasma membrane is referred to as the membrane potential. If the charges are permitted to come together, they have the ability to do the work. An electrical, chemical, or mechanical stimulus may alter the resting potential by increasing the membrane's permeability to sodium. If you remember, the resting potential is the membrane potential in a resting or not excited neuron. When a stimulus causes sodium ions to move into the neuron, the membrane potential has become less negative than the resting level. The membrane is described as depolarized. Because depolarization brings a neuron closer to transmitting a neural impulse, it is excitatory. In contrast, when a stimulus affects the permeability of the neuron plasma membrane in a way that causes the membrane potential to become more negative than the resting potential, the membrane is hyperpolarized. Hyperpolarization decreases the ability of the neuron to generate a neural impulse, and it is described as inhibitory. When a stimulus is sufficiently strong, voltage-activated ion channels in the plasma membrane open. Sodium enters the neuron through specific channels that have gates. The sodium depolarizes the membrane. The magnitude of the resting potential is determined by differences in concentrations of specific ions, mainly positively charged sodium and potassium ions, inside the cell relative to the extracellular fluid and selective permeability of the plasma membranes to these ions. Ions pass through specific passive ion channels in the plasma membrane. Potassium ions leak out more readily than sodium ions can leak in. Chloride ions accumulate along the inner surface of the plasma membrane. Proteins inside the cell, which are too large to cross the plasma membrane, contribute to the negative charges. The gradients that determine the resting potential are maintained by sodium-potassium pumps in the plasma membrane. These pumps continuously transport sodium out of the neuron and transport potassium in. When a stimulus is sufficiently strong, voltage-activated ion channels in the plasma membrane open. Sodium enters the neuron through specific channels that have gates. The sodium depolarizes the membrane. When the voltage across the membrane is decreased to a critical point, called the threshold level, a neural impulse called an action potential is generated. An action potential moves down the axon. Repolarization occurs behind it. Changes in the permeability of ion channels bring the membrane back to its relatively negative state. Sodium ion channels close and potassium channels open, allowing potassium to leave the neuron. During the millisecond or so in which it is depolarized, the axon membrane is in an absolute refractory period, meaning it cannot transmit another action potential, no matter how great of a stimulus is applied. This is because the voltage-activated sodium channels are inactivated. Until their gates reset, they cannot be reopened. When enough sodium channel gates have been reset, the neuron enters a relative refractory period that lasts a few additional milliseconds. During this period, the axon can transmit impulses, but the threshold is even higher. Even with the limits imposed by their refractory periods, most neurons can transmit several hundred impulses per second. With an all or none response, no variation exists in the strength of a single impulse. The membrane potential either exceeds the threshold level and an action potential is transmitted, or it does not. With continuous conduction, the smooth progressive transmission of neural impulses occurs. This happens in unmyelinated neurons. Finally, with saltatory conduction is when the action potential jumps along the axon from one Ranvier, which is not myelated, to the next. It occurs when the ion activity at the active node depolarizes the next node along the action. This conduction is faster and requires less energy than continuous conduction. And this is a picture here showing how the ion channels open and how you can get an action potential. A synapse is a junction between two neurons or between a neuron and a muscle or a gland. A presynaptic neuron is a neuron that terminates at a specific synapse. A postsynaptic neuron is a neuron that begins at a synapse. The synaptic cleft separates a presynaptic neuron from a postsynaptic neuron. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that transmit the neurosignal across the synapse and signal other neurons or muscles or glands. There are more than 50 different neurotransmitters that have been identified. Some neurotransmitters modify the effect of other neurotransmitters. For example, they may amplify or dampen the response of a postsynaptic cell. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter released from motor neurons that triggers muscle contraction. Acetylcholine is released by some neurons in the brain and in the autonomic nervous system. Cells that release this neurotransmitter are referred to as cholinergic neurons. Acetylcholine is thought to signal neurons involved in logical thinking and forming memories. Norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine belong to the group of neurotransmitters called catecholamines. These compounds, along with the neurotransmitter serotonin, affect mood, and their imbalance has been linked to several mental disorders. Certain amino acids also serve as neurotransmitters. Glutamate is a major excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. GABA, which is a type of amino acid, inhibits interneurons in the central nervous system. Each time an action potential releases a synaptic terminal, calcium ions from the extracellular fluid flow into the synaptic terminal. The calcium ions stimulate synaptic vesicles to fuse with the presynaptic membrane and release neurotransmitter molecules into the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitter molecules diffuse across the synaptic cleft and combine with the specific receptors on the plasma membrane of postsynaptic cells. These receptors are found on dendrites and cell bodies of postsynaptic neurons and on the plasma membranes of muscle fibers and gland cells. This is an area of biomedical research. Many neurotransmitter receptors are chemically activated ion channels. When activated, they change the permeability of the membrane to sodium and other ions. When a sufficient number of receptors are activated, the postsynaptic neuron may reach the threshold level. Depolarization occurs and the neuron transmits an action potential. If repolarization of a postsynaptic cell is to occur quickly, excess neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft must be removed. Some neurotranslators are inactivated by enzymes. Reuptake is when neurotransmitters are actively transported back into the synaptic terminals. With reuptake, the neurotransmitters are repackaged in vesicles and recycled. Many drugs inhibit the reuptake of neurotransmitters. For example, SSRIs inhibit the reuptake of serotonin. This action increases the serotonin concentration in the synaptic cleft. A postsynaptic neuron may have receptors for several types of neurotransmitters. Some of the receptors may be excitatory, and others may be inhibitory. Depending on the type of postsynaptic receptor with which it combines, the same neurotransmitter can have different effects. For example, acetylcholine has an excitatory effect on skeletal muscle. It has an inhibitory effect on cardiac muscles. Excitatory postsynaptic potential is a change in the membrane potential that brings the neuron closer to firing. Inhibitory postsynaptic potential is a neurotransmitter receptor combination that hyperpolarizes the postsynaptic membrane and takes the neuron further away from the firing level. Each excitatory postsynaptic potential or inhibitory postsynaptic potential is not an all or none response. They do not travel like action potentials. Rather, each is a graded response that may be added to or subtracted to from other excitatory postsynaptic potentials or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. Neural integration is the process of summing incoming signals. Most neurointegration occurs in the central nervous system. This is because more than 90% of the neurons in the body are located in the central nervous system. So we have divisions of the nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all of the nerves outside of the central nervous system. The brain and spinal cord are the central nervous system. These organs serve as the control center of the body. They receive and integrate incoming information and determine appropriate responses. The peripheral nervous system is made up of the sensory receptors and nerves, which are the communication lines to and from the central nervous system. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that link the brain, and 31 pairs of spinal nerves that link the spinal cord with the sensory receptors and with other parts of the body. So we have the central nervous system. It acts as the integration and command center. It takes in all conscious and subconscious sensory information. It makes decisions and initiates responses to maintain homeostasis. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It controls voluntary muscle movement, processes information received from the sensory organs, and allows us to speak. The cerebellum helps coordinate the brain's commands to muscle movement and assist with balance. The brainstem connects the spinal cord to the brain, regulates body temperature, blood pressure, respirations, and heartbeat. And the spinal cord is surrounded and protected by vertebrae. The brain has an estimated 100 billion neurons, which are connected to thousands of other neurons. Neurons in the brain maintain an appropriate heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, temperature, muscle tone, and blood chemistry. The medulla, pons, and midbrain make up the brainstem, which is the elongated portion of the brain that looks like a stalk for the cerebrum. The brain is a hollow organ. Its fluid-filled spaces are called ventricles. The medulla is where the cardiovascular and respiratory systems link together into a united system that controls heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure. The medulla contains cardiac centers, which control heart rate, vasomotor centers, which help regulate blood pressure by controlling the diameter of the blood vessels, and respiratory centers, which initiate and regulate breathing. Centers for other reflex actions such as vomiting, sneezing, coughing, and swallowing are also found within the medulla. The reticular formation is a network of neurons that extends from the spinal cord through the medulla and upward through the brainstem and the thalamus. It receives sensory information from the spinal cord and brainstem and influences the level of arousal. The pons connects various parts of the brain. It contains centers that help regulate respiration and sleep. The midbrain is the shortest portion of the brainstem. It extends from the pons to the diencephalon. It regulates visual and auditory reflexes. The thalamus is the main sensory relay center between the spinal cord and the cerebrum. Incoming messages are stored and partially interpreted here before being relayed to appropriate centers in the cerebrum. The hypothalamus contains centers for control of body temperature, appetite, and water balance. It regulates the pituitary gland and links the nervous and endocrine systems. The cerebellum is responsible for smooth, coordinated movement. It helps maintain posture and muscle tone. It helps maintain equilibrium. It controls eye movements. It is important in learning motor skills and planning and coordinating voluntary movements. The cerebrum is the center of consciousness, intellect, memory, and language. It receives and interprets sensory information from sense organs and controls motor function. The cerebrum is the largest and most prominent part of the human brain. It controls motor activities, interprets sensation, and serves as the center of intellect, memory, language, and consciousness. The longitudinal fissure partially divides the cerebrum into right and left halves or hemispheres. The temporal lobe is separated from the frontal and parietal lobes by the lateral fissure. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of gray matter that covers the cerebrum. It consists of gray matter and white matter. The fornix connects part of the cortex with the hypothalamus. Gray matter is made up of cell bodies and unmyelinated axons and neurons. White matter consists of myelinated axons that connect various regions of the brain. It connects neurons within the same hemisphere. The right and left hemisphere is the corpus callosum, and the cerebrum with other parts of the brain and spinal cord. Deep within the white matter lie the basal ganglia, which are paired nuclei that play an important role in automatic movements. Divided into sensory, motor, and association areas, sensory areas receive incoming sensory information. Motor areas control voluntary movement. Association areas connect sensory and motor areas. Association areas are responsible for all intellectual activities of the brain. For example, the prefrontal association area is largely responsible for executive functioning. Fissure and sulci divide each cerebral hemisphere into four major lobes. We have the frontal lobe, which is important for voluntary movement, expressive language, and for managing higher level executive functioning. The parietal lobe, which is vital for sensory perception and integration, including the management of taste, hearing, sight, touch, and smell. The occipital lobe, which is responsible for visual perception, including color, form, and motion. And the temporal lobe, which is responsible for processing auditory information and with the encoding of memory. The limbic system is an action system in the brain. It's a group of interconnected nuclei involved in memory and the regulation of emotion. The two major regions are the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus is involved in the formation and retrieval of memories. It helps file experiences into categories so that similar memories can be stored together. The amygdala may process incoming information associated with particular emotions. Parts of the limbic system appear to be involved in the process of attachment or bonding between a baby and his or her caregiver. Next, we have the spinal cord. It transmits information to and from the brain. It controls many reflex activities of the body. The ascending tracts transmit sensory information up the spinal cord to the brain. Descending tracts transmit impulses from the brain back down the spinal cord to efferent nerves. The meninges are the three connective layers covering the brain and spinal cord. Dura mater is the outermost of the meninges. It's a tough double-layer membrane. Arachnoid is a thin, delicate membrane that has fibers that extend to the pia mater. The pia mater is a very thin membrane that adheres closely to the brain and spinal cord. It's the innermost layer. Cerebral spinal fluid is shock-absorbing fluid that fills the ventricles and subarachnoid spaces. It circulates through the ventricles and then passes into the subarachnoid space. It is reabsorbed into the blood through arachnoid villi. Ventricles are cavities within the brain. Subarachnoid space is the space between the arachnoid layer and the pia mater. The brain floats in cerebral spinal fluid, which protects it from injury. The peripheral nervous system is composed primarily of spinal nerves that carry impulses to and from the spinal cord and cranial nerves that carry impulses to and from the brain. The peripheral nervous system links all parts of the body by carrying impulses from the sensory receptors in the central nervous system and from the central nervous system to muscles or glands. The subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system are the sensory and the afferent. So sensory is responsible for delivering messages received by the sensory organs to the brain via sensory neurons. The A for afferent means arriving to the brain. It can also mean accepting new information. The motor subdivision of the peripheral nervous system is responsible for carrying information from the central nervous system. E means exiting the brain. It's further divided into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. The somatic and autonomic divisions of the peripheral nervous system have afferent nerves, also called sensory nerves, which transmit messages from receptors to the central nervous system, and efferent nerves, also called motor nerves, which transmit information back from the central nervous system to the structure that must respond. So in the peripheral nervous system, it's divided into somatic and autonomic divisions. Sensory receptors and nerves concerned with changes in the outside environment are somatic. Those that regulate the internal environment are automatic. The autonomic nervous system helps to maintain homeostasis. The two main types of receptors in the autonomic division are cholinergic receptors and adrenergic receptors. Cholinergic receptors are activated when acetylcholine binds with them. Adrenergic receptors are targets for many catecholamines. So examples, beta blockers, black, norepinephrine. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that emerge from the brain. Cranial nerves transmit information to the brain from sensory receptors. They then transmit orders in the form of neurosignals from the brain to muscles and glands. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that emerge from the spinal cord. They are mixed nerves that transmit sensory information to the spinal cord through their afferent neurons and transmit information from the spinal cord to various parts of the body through their efferent neurons. So the autonomic nervous system is involuntary. The somatic nervous system is voluntary. The nervous system further divides, so there are subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. So you have sympathetic, which activates during emergency situations. It's the fight or flight response, which enables the body to cope rapidly and vigorously with situations that may disrupt homeostasis. So in that response, blood vessels dilate, to prepare the body to run faster or fight better. You might be familiar with stories involving superhuman strength, such as a parent lifting a car off a child. These situations are an example of how the sympathetic nervous system works. Then you have the parasympathetic nervous system, which controls involuntary activities that are not emergency. So think of that as rest and digest. It calms the body systems. This picture shows how the nervous system is divided. So aging affects the nervous system. As you age, you have slower reflexes, increased risk of falling, short-term memory loss, decreased sense of touch. Some may have hearing loss, and you have decreased vision, sense of smell, and sense of taste.